Alright guys, how you doing? This is Mr. Cochran. Welcome to our second attempt at the flipped video. Today's video we're going to be looking at The Minister's Black Veil by Nathaniel Hawthorne. That's going to be the next piece we read. So this one's going to be a little different than the last video. This one's going to kind of introduce you to the story, give you some things to look for while you read. So, first things first, the setting of the story. It's a small village, not very large. It's old, it's well established, it's Puritan, which is an important thing. Remember from last semester when we talked about the Puritans, when we read some of their things, Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, things like that. Religion, very big to the Puritans. Life revolved around God. You lived to serve God. You learned to read so you could read the Bible, things like that. So the fact that this story takes place in a small Puritan village, that's an important piece of information you want to keep in mind as you're reading. So our basic characters, our protagonist, again remember, main character is protagonist, is Reverend Hooper. He's a minister, just like the title implies. He wears a black veil. He believes it symbolizes sin, so he wears it. He shows up early in the story and he wears it until the end of the story. You have Elizabeth, Hooper's fiance. I know some people reading this story might be like, wait a minute, a reverend can have a fiance, a reverend can get married. Yeah, Reverend Hooper has a fiance, Elizabeth. As you can see, as you'll read, their marriage, their engagement kind of falls apart because he refuses to take off the veil in her presence. She's not completely against the veil, but she wants him to take off the veil in her presence. You know, it's not very romantic to be engaged to a guy and his face is always covered. And so when he won't take the veil off, she ends the engagement. Another character, you also have Reverend Clark, a younger minister from a nearby town. He comes in when Reverend Hooper's on his deathbed, not doing very well, prays for him, tries to give him some guidance, things like that. And then you have the townspeople. There's some specific townspeople, but as a character, they're kind of a group. They act in kind of consort. They're while you get individual names in the story, the townspeople are kind of a single group to think about. They're highly religious again. They're Puritan. Religion's very important to them. They're nervous. The change in their minister. This is something kind of new. Just one day he shows up in this veil and it keeps happening, and that makes them nervous. They're not sure how to react. They're not sure how they feel about it. They revere Reverend Hooper. They respect him for what he's doing, even as he continues to wear the veil. They'll speak of him with admiration, impressed that he can do it, while at the same time shunning him, like it says here. Not sure. So they're kind of paradoxically impressed by him, while also kind of pushing him away. So that's something to keep an eye on as you're reading the story. So a real just kind of brief summary because Hawthorne's sometimes is a little difficult to read, so a brief summary here, so you have that as you're going through the story. Reverend Hooper, neat, orderly. One day he shows up to give his sermon. He's wearing this black veil. It's covering his face. All the townspeople can see mouth and chin. It's not completely opaque, but it's covering his face. It starts to isolate him from his companionships, like we talked about in the previous slide with Elizabeth, his fiance. The veil starts to separate Reverend Hooper from other people in town. It becomes a barrier. It becomes a way for him to separate himself. He stops getting invited to dinner. His fiancée Elizabeth leaves him, but he continues to wear the veil all the way to his grave. He never takes it off. He wears it from that day until the end. And so this this story from Hawthorne is kind of an exploration of the minister Hooper wearing this veil, why he wears this veil, reactions to wearing the veil, things like this. So it's a fairly interesting exploration into the psychology and stuff. Um, this is somewhat based on a true story. Hawthorne, inspired by clergyman and actual Reverend Joseph Moody, who was nicknamed, like it says, Handkerchief Moody, because he wore a black veil from very early in his life until his funeral. As a younger child, Moody accidentally killed one of his friends, and is kind of a symbol of his shame as a way to make up for it out of guilt and all this. He wore a veil from that friend's funeral until Moody himself died. The picture here is kind of a representation. This isn't an actual picture of Moody, but it's a representation of what it might have looked like. But the fact that Moody actually wore the veil is true. So that could have inspired Hawthorne to write the story about Reverend Hooper. So what we're going to look at next is we're going to read just a little bit of the beginning, kind of get you used to Hawthorne, his writing, the language, things like that, and then give you some things to look for. Okay? So we've got The Minister's Black Veil by Nathaniel Hawthorne, a parable. The sexton stood in the porch of the Milford meeting house, pulling busily at the bell rope. The old people of the village came stooping along the street. Children with bright faces tripped merrily beside their parents or mimicked a graver gait, in the conscious dignity of their Sunday clothes. Spruce bachelors looked sidelong at the pretty maidens and fancied that the Sabbath sunshine made them prettier than on weekdays. When the throng had mostly streamed into the porch, the sexton began to toll the bell, keeping his eye on the Reverend Mr. Hooper's door. The first glimpse of the clergyman's figure was the signal for the bell to cease its summons. "But what has good Parson Hooper got upon his face?" cried the sexton in astonishment. All within hearing immediately turned about, and beheld the semblance of Mr. Hooper, pacing slowly his meditative way towards the meeting-house. With one accord they started expressing more wonder than if some strange minister were coming to dust the cushions of Mr. Hooper's pulpit. "Are you sure it's our parson?" inquired Goodman Gray of the sexton. "Of a certainty it is good Mr. Hooper," replied the sexton. "He was to have exchanged pulpits with Parson Shute of Westbury, but Parson Shute sent to excuse himself yesterday, being to preach a funeral sermon." The cause of so much amazement may appear sufficiently slight. Mr. Hooper, a gentlemanly person of about 30, though still a bachelor, was dressed with due clerical neatness, as if a careful wife had starched his band and brushed the weekly dust from his Sunday garb. There was but one thing remarkable in his appearance. Swathed about his forehead and hanging down over his face, so low as to be shaken by his breath, Mr. Hooper had on a black veil. On a nearer view it seemed to consist of 2 folds of crape, which entirely concealed his features, except the mouth and chin, but probably did not intercept his sight, further than to give a darkened aspect to all living and inanimate things. With this gloomy shade before him, good Mr. Hooper walked onward, at a slow and quiet pace, stooping somewhat, and looking on the ground, as is customary with abstracted men, yet nodding kindly to those of his parishioners who still waited on meeting-house steps. But so wonderstruck were they that his greeting hardly met with a return. Okay, so that's kind of the beginning of the story there. Some interesting things already happening. Remember, we're talking about characterization, and we start to get some characterization of Reverend Hooper in this beginning part. Oops, excuse me there as I mess with the text. We start especially down here. In this part, we start to see about Hooper. They talk about him being a gentlemanly person of about 30. And because this one's right there, this is our direct characterization. Remember, if you can put quotes around it, if it comes straight from the text, it's direct characterization. There's some other places where they give us some indirect characterization. And so that's something you want to keep an eye on as you're reading. But we start to see about Mr. Hooper, the black veil showing up early in the story. So what you guys need to do for class is go to the blog under the readings. You'll see the Minister's Black Veil. It's not very long. It's about 11 pages. And you just want to read through it, kind of get the plot, keep an eye out on what's going on, things like that. As you're reading, as you get done, you want to think about why would Reverend Hooper wear this veil? Moody, the inspiration again for maybe why Hawthorne wrote this story, wore it kind of out of guilt, out of penance, making up for what he did. Why is Hooper wearing the veil? You want to think about that. What might it symbolize? Hooper will give his idea of what he thinks it symbolizes, but you want to think about what you think it symbolizes. What might it represent? Why won't he remove the veil? Why is this so important to this man? His final words. He's on his deathbed. Reverend Hooper, the story ends with him dying, and his final words, usually the final words are very profound and so forth. So you want to look at his final words and think about what that has to do with why he wore the veil. And then kind of a text to self connection, putting yourself in Reverend Hooper's shoes. What ways might you wear a black veil? Maybe not literally, but symbolically. So those are some things to ponder as you're reading through this story. Again, you can find the story on the blog. In case you forgot what the blog is, it's MLK American Lit .blogspot.com. So that was our second flipped video. We're going to keep going with these. This one's a little different. So remember, for next class, for Monday, please read through the Minister's Black Veil. So Monday we can talk about it and work some more with it. If you have any questions, please feel free to email myself or Mr. Smith. Thank you very much.